Welcome to a special episode of the Managing Madrid Podcast. We are going to dive into a two-part episode which discusses all things El Caso Figo, the Netflix documentary that went up recently. It was amazing. Finally got a chance to watch it. So part one, we have David Tryhorn. He comes on. He is the co-director of this documentary. Told me about everything, the process of getting all these guys, the behind the scenes. Fascinating discussion with him. And then part two is Matt, Wiltse, and I. We react more to the documentary, and it goes pretty lengthy. I think it's about almost 2 hours long. So kick back, enjoy it. Really proud of this one. Had a lot of fun discussing it. And we're going to get started with the voices of Derek Ray and Ray Hudson. Let's go.
Nice article in the Managing Madrid blog. Wonderful lads that do a great job there. And worth reading about that man there. Karim Benzema needs to rest, and the numbers reveal why.
Times ended up almost looking like a 6-3-1. Some very good writing about that on the Managing Madrid website. First rate podcast as well. Of course, Fede Valverde was a huge part of the equation.
Hello and welcome to a special Sunday edition of the Managing Madrid Podcast, a very long delayed episode. Our listeners have been begging us to record something, our thoughts, our reactions to El Caso Figo, which was, quite frankly, one of the best documentaries I've seen in the last couple of years, and the one I've probably enjoyed the most since watching The Last Dance, which really hit home. And this one was particularly close to home as well because I lived through the Figo era. And I'm humbled and thankful and very appreciative of the co-director of El Caso Figo, David Tryhorn. He is joining the podcast tonight, and we're going to discuss the making of it and some of the behind the scenes and everything else Figo related. So David, welcome to the show. How you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me on, Kiyan. Really appreciate it.
I got to say, I went into this documentary thinking, I'm not going to learn anything new, but I'm going to enjoy it. That's the mindset I went in with, and I was completely wrong. I learned a ton of new things. I thought it was incredibly captivating, from the opening scenes of the jarring atmosphere of the Camp Nou that night when Figo returned as a Real Madrid player, to throughout the entire thing. The stories from the agents at the time, Florentino coming in, Pep Guardiola stories, everything was just engaging and captivating from minute one till the end. So I guess we can start here, David. Why the Figo case? Why did you want to create something on that in particular?
Well, the film came to us. It was developed by the production company I work with, Pitch, and it was developed by our head of development because we knew that we knew some of the big streamers, particularly Netflix, were looking for Spanish stories. And it was a story that when it initially came my way, I was quite skeptical about. Because I thought, right, one, we're not going to get all the main people involved. And that is the 5 main people really inside the deal. And a few of those important figures on the sidelines, people like Pep Guardiola. I just didn't think we were going to get them. Then I thought, if we did get them, they're not going to be giving us honest, open interviews, and we can talk about all honesty and open and all the rest of it in a bit. But I thought, okay, they're not going to give some big interviews. And then 3, I thought there's not going to be this is something that largely happened behind closed doors. So there's not going to be a significant amount of archive. And fortunately, I was wrong on all 3 counts. So we just thought it's the most controversial transfer in the history of football. And more than that, though, it's a kind of groundbreaking transfer. It changes the modern game. I think there's so much that you can sort of you can go back to that moment in the summer of 2000. So not only is it controversial, it's also this seismic moment in football. So I think those things were really appealing with the story. And then you've got a player of the stature of Luis Figo. So for us, the first thing was kind of sounding this idea out with Figo. I think initially he probably thought, I think he liked the idea of a Netflix film and probably thought this is going to be my greatest hits. And slowly during the process, we sort of convinced him that, no, let's do it on the 3 worst weeks of your professional career. Which takes some convincing to do. And then bit by bit over the months, all the other pieces started falling into place. Figo himself was exceptionally helpful getting He helped us with Paulo Futre and with Jose Veiga, his agent, his former agent, who's never spoken about the case before, and ultimately with Florentino as well. But it's for us, we were so concerned to try and get everyone. And as you said before, it's something where most of this story has been in the Spanish press or in various books or on other documentaries at one point or another. But we wanted to piece it together in the most coherent possible way, the whole story, and with people who'd never spoken. You know, as I said, the Jose Veiga part, we had this very kind of research timeline at the beginning of the film. But once we spoke to Jose Veiga, he managed to fill in a lot of the gaps because, as I said, he's the only one who had never gone on record before. But there's archive that people have never seen. I think the way we pieced it together would give you a whole new kind of feeling of it. And it's the fact that it's the key for us was get everyone, be inside it. So, cool. That probably answered that and about 3 other questions. Sorry.
Well, I think it's amazing too, because I think you hit home on a lot of the things that you needed to hit home on, in that you got everyone, you got the main protagonists, and you got them to say new things. And I think that's part of I think the main person who really made this something kind of, you learn a lot of new things, was the Veiga aspect. But it also just didn't come across as a documentary that was too scripted or too, pushing one single narrative. Everyone was pretty candid, gave their own side of the story. And all of a sudden you have this piece of the puzzle that's kind of fitting. And then I feel like, the viewer comes up with their own conclusion in a way, like a movie, because you hear Figo's side, you hear Veiga's side, you hear Gaspard's side, you hear Florentino's side. And in the end, like, my wife was watching this with me, and she was like, throughout various parts of the documentary, she would point at, this guy or that guy, he's lying. No, he's telling the truth. And so it's interesting because, like, you hear every perspective, and I thought that's what made it so fascinating. So
I think in that sense, we actually said at the beginning, this is a film that almost couldn't be made by a Spaniard, because either you're a Madrid fan or you're a Barca fan. And even if you're a Betis fan, you probably have an opinion about Madrid and Barca. Whereas both Ben, my co-director, and I, we have zero allegiance to either team. So we can go into this from a very neutral perspective. And then the second thing, I think, as you were saying, it is ultimately a film. It's all about truth and who's telling the truth and who's not telling the truth. And I guess there's 2 things around that. So I think one, at first, I think we really wanted to give this let's find out what really happened. We're going to tell the account of what really happened. And then sort of halfway through, we were like, this is going to be the biggest mistake if we do this, because otherwise we're just going to it's going to be one more version of the truth. And it's going to be our truth, and it's not necessarily going to be true. So let's let everyone say their piece. Let's let them contradict each other, and then the audience can work that out. Which then plays into this whole fact that I think when we saw this film, as you said, I think there's a lot of sports documentaries out at the moment. They're often very polished. They're often very approved. You can feel they've gone through kind of legal approvals with clubs or players or agents. And it was this idea: we want to get everyone, but we'll spare no one. We want it to feel honest and authentic, but also we want it to feel like a movie, as you said, like a thriller. And I thought that was the cool thing. At the end of the day, it's a transfer where nothing outwardly illegal happens, and a transfer is essentially human resources. And we were like, right, let's make it a true crime thriller. And that makes it quite fun to give it that element of something. It's a heist movie. It's Florentino Perez. We always said Figo is the shiny diamond. He's trying to steal, 1, to kind of get into power himself, but 2, to screw over his the biggest rivals. I think what we didn't see, it's like a double heist movie as well, that then you have Veiga and Futre with their eye on the commission. And they're both kind of going in that direction, with Figo, this kind of pawn in the middle. But yeah, I think that's what made it fun for us, that we could sort of play with it more as this thriller.
So you had so many interesting characters and personalities in this documentary who probably have some opposing views. I'm just wondering, at any point during the filming, did any of these people interact with each other, or was it completely in isolation? So Gaspard never saw Figo, Pep never saw Figo, or were they kind of on the set together? Did they interact at any point?
No, no, they didn't. We did all the interviews separately. So, for instance, when Pep turned up, he knew that this was about Figo, but he didn't really know much more than that. And I don't think the two of them speak particularly regularly anymore. Yeah, it's the same with Gaspard. He knew who we were talking to, but he didn't know what anyone else was saying. I guess the only two where there was a bit of interaction was when we spoke to Futre, Paulo Futre, who's a phenomenal character in the film. But when he said, "Look, I will do it, but only if I can speak to Luis, because I want to know that I can tell the whole truth." So we said, "Look, we're interviewing Figo in Madrid. Why don't you come along? You guys can have a coffee or a beer afterwards, and then you do your interview with us if you're happy." So he turned up. We did our interview. We interviewed Figo across a few days, but that was the long sort of first interview we did with him. And then Paulo turned up. They went for a kind of beer or coffee, which lasted for hours. And you could see kind of Paulo Futre holding court, telling his stories. And then he came in and was sort of like, "Right, how long do you need?" Which is always, with footballers, and I've interviewed so many footballers, you always have that, "How long do you need?" And you're like, they're going to try and bring the time down. So I said, "Look, ideally an hour." And then he said, "I can't do it in an hour." So I thought, okay, maybe, okay, half an hour, something. Just, we need something. He goes, no, I need 5 hours to do this properly, which I don't think any footballer's ever said before. He goes, "But I don't have 5 hours." I said, "Well, let's just do a couple of hours and see where we go from there." I think I said it was probably the best interview I've ever given. Yeah, I only asked 3 questions.
Wow.
And he just spoke for about 3 hours and just went through it all. And there's so many other little details that that you have to sort of leave on the cutting room floor because they don't quite work for the film you're making. But yeah, so that was probably the only time there was some interaction between Figo and Futre. But otherwise, I don't know, maybe people were calling or they'd speak to each other. But I think, these things are generally quite separate.
Did you get, I guess this is kind of a 2-part question, but did you get any sense of reaction from anyone after it's published and everyone sees their own side of the story, plus then they get to see everyone else's side of the story? And also, do you have any inclinations of what the relationship between Veiga and Figo is now?
So the relationship between Veiga and Figo, I think, is good.
Okay.
I think, Veiga remained his agent till about 2004. So even after the deal, they stayed close. Figo was instrumental in helping us get Veiga. They still speak every now and then, and Veiga was very happy. He's extremely proud of his relationship with Luis, and he's extremely proud of the deal as well. He sees it as a high point in his career rather than a sort of low point. So yeah, that's that one. In terms of reaction since watching it, so Luis had no editorial control on the film, obviously, but he's watched it several times and was very happy with it. Last time we checked, that was before it aired on Netflix. So I don't know if he's changed his mind since then, but he was very happy with it. Jose Veiga texted me to say that he was super happy with the film. Apart from that, I haven't really heard anything. I've heard some bits that Futre was a bit unhappy at lots of things that were cut out. I know that I think Gaspard said in an interview he wasn't given a right to reply by us, which is rubbish because once we got Veiga's testimony, we actually asked Gaspard for a second interview because we said, "Look, we've got all this new stuff," but he was very adamant that he'd said his piece and he didn't want to give another interview. So yeah, that's it as far as I know in terms of reaction.
I have to say, you can kind of paint as you're watching it. I feel like Gaspard watching that probably would have been he didn't come across as the hero of the story in a lot of ways. I think the one that came across as really genuine was Pep. He comes off across as this real sweetheart in the documentary who genuinely just loved Figo. He was you could see the sadness in his voice that the whole thing happened and the way it went down. Did you just have any, maybe just memories of interacting with Pep or anything, interesting stories that you know?
It's quite funny. A lot of people have told us that and I think maybe because those 5 central guys in the film, what we try to do is make sure that kind of because I think, I think they're all telling their own truth in a way, but everyone's truth of the same incident doesn't necessarily align, and maybe some are bending that truth a little more than others, but I think you're meant to feel that all five of them, you like all of them and you trust them, but you don't quite trust them. So I think what's really interesting about Pep is not only is he this sort of counterpoint to Figo's career, at the end we stress that he was the most successful ever coach at Barcelona, because almost like if Figo had stayed at Barcelona, it's like you could have been Pep's assistant or something. You could have had a statue outside of the Camp Nou. But so I think he definitely has this. His career is a counterpoint to Figo, but I think he definitely has this authentic voice because he's not inside the deal. And you can actually see, as you said, there feels this. He's very reflective, and in the archive, you can feel his voice cracking. When he says he's sad, he seems genuinely sad in the archive images.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably something a little bit wistful. They were super close then; they're not close now. I don't think only because I think lives and take you in different directions. I'm sure once Figo signed for Madrid, it was very difficult then, being friends with the Catalan poster boy. And then you just don't really, they go in different directions, play in different countries. So there might be a sense of wistfulness from Pep of, sort of friendships past, but that's me guessing and putting words into his head. But no, I think he was a very genuine guy, as he always is. He always comes across as a very reflective, thoughtful interviewee. But I think in terms of our film, it really helped having that kind of voice of someone you felt who really sort of was thinking about it and was a little bit broken about it at the time.
What I also learned from that too was that I didn't know they were that close. Obviously, we all know they were teammates. I didn't know kind of they were rooming together. They were kind of, really, really close, and I didn't realize they were that close, where they were basically best friends. They were rooming together everywhere. They were sitting together.
I think godfathers to each other's children or something like that as well. They were super. I was the same as you. We were sort of like, right, let's study that Barcelona team. And I remember that Barcelona team now. It's incredible. If you actually think, we were saying this the other day, if you think of that Barcelona dressing room when Figo left, I know Van Gaal had just left just before, but you had Van Gaal, you had Mourinho as his assistant. You had Pep in there. You had Luis Enrique in there, current Spain manager. You had Rivaldo in there, and then and then Figo was the guy kind of bossing that dressing room as well. It's a very alpha dressing room in terms of sort of egos and football knowledge.
Yeah.
But yeah, we thought, well, we'd love to get Pep, and then obviously as you dive into the research, you sort of realize, oh no, these guys were super tight together.
Yeah. I often wonder what Figo's legacy at Barcelona would have been had he stayed. Because he was basically a cult hero already. He identified with their values, the Catalan independence. He was basically, it's very rare that a foreigner could come into Barcelona and hit home like that. Like Stoichkov had that, Figo had that. And you just imagine, had he stayed, instead of going to Real Madrid, you just wonder what his legacy would have been there. It would have been, it would have been one of the greatest, I think, they ever had. And that completely shifted, obviously, when he went to Real Madrid, because, as we saw in his return and the reaction to that. One thing, David, that I wanted to ask you, and I don't know if this was something that only I noticed, or, I don't know if I overblew it in my head, but I noticed looking at the footage, you omitted the pig's head. And was that intentional, or was that just like, nah, we don't need it, or was like, no, we shouldn't put in the doc? Like, am I overthinking that part?
This is good. I don't go on social media much at all, and I see, but every now and then you're checking to see what the reaction is or whatever, and you see it seems to be the comment that comes up most. Where's the pig's head? And I'm always tempted to like, actually, this is the reason why, and then I'm like, no, I can't be bothered. So the reason behind omitting the pig's head, it's not that we're anti-pig's heads. It was more of a case that when it happened, no one noticed at the time. So I think it was only a day or two later in the papers, the first kind of image of there's the pig's head. And there's one image, like a wide shot, and if you slow it down, you can just see this pig's head come on. I think it hits like Roberto Carlos on the calf. and it's tiny. It's the size of like the head is the size of my hand, so you can't notice it as a pig's head. It looks like a little mouse or something has just been thrown on the pitch. So the fact that no one commentates, if you notice in the documentary, we try and do everything in the present tense. So even when people are talking about something that happened before, it's as it's happening. So we try never to be retrospective about anything. And because no one noticed it at the time, because the commentators don't mention it when it's going on, and we tried so hard to get the pig's head in, because we were like, this is obviously the iconic symbolic image of this moment. But it just never worked, because we could never do it in a way that suddenly it would have broken the grammar of the film if we were suddenly going, and then 2 days later, there were images that a pig's head had come off the pitch. And it's like, well, we've already moved on from there. So it's one of those things that, yes, I know it's a Luis Figo transfer story. It should have the pig's head in, but it just didn't work with how we'd made the film. And it's good. So it gives something to people to argue about.
Just bouncing around again. What was it like speaking with Florentino Perez? I thought it was just hilarious. Like, he just walks into the set, and then, like, I think his first line was, "I'm telling the truth, I'm the protagonist." And it's like just a classic, like, Godfather moment. That's like how he is. It was incredible that was like his first line. What was it like interacting with him?
Well, he's actually very mild-mannered in a way. He's quite kind of, I don't think he's particularly comfortable doing lots of interviews, and he doesn't do lots of interviews, especially in this kind of format and that's not news and a documentary. He was the guy where we thought he was the guy we never expected to get, and we thought we're going to have one shot at him, but if we mess that up, then we're not going to get him, and then it's going to be a huge hole in the film. Even though he's incredibly present in the archive, which we were always, well, at least we've got so much of him in the archive, maybe it won't matter. But he was the last interview we got, because we were just very patient about it. We were speaking to lots of Spanish journalists. We were speaking to lots of people we knew in Spain, sort of asking them, how do we get him? How do we get him? What's the best approach? And generally the consensus was, Figo's got to help you. And so then it was persuading Figo to help us and pick up the phone to Florentino and say, look, I need you in my film, which he did. And Florentino accepted. And we were given sort of parameters. You've got to come to Madrid. It's got to be, need to see the questions, got this much time, has to be in the trophy room. And then we were sort of saying, no, we've got a backdrop for all our interviews. No, it has to have the trophies. And we then persuaded them, no, let us do our backdrop. Otherwise it's going to look strange. And then he was very nice. He was extremely charming. Answered all our questions. Obviously, probably much more with generalities than the others, but he still works in football. He's a very clever man. He's not going to start giving anti-Barcelona messages, especially at the current time. So no, he was very charming with the entire crew. And yeah, I love that. I think we were never expecting him to answer that question of who's telling the truth. And when he said, it's me, I'm the protagonist, it was perfect for us, because, we'd had Figo say exactly the same thing. And then this guy comes in, and then it was a case, because we'd already cut about 80% of the film by the time we were able to use the interview, but we already knew, we were like, if we have Florentino, we bring him in late. It has to feel that shock, wow moment of a guy, the audience basically thinks, well, this is good, but they haven't got Florentino. And then always around that hour mark, the film's starting to kind of like, okay, I think I know where this is going. And then as he walks in, I think you're like, okay, I wasn't expecting that. And it gives it that slight, yeah, probably right, a bit Godfathery, but.
It was very, like to a T, like, the memes about Florentino, like that, that's the stuff that people always post about, like that side of him. Like, and I got to say, like, just watching the film, it was inspiring, like, just, I guess, the balls he had, because during the whole thing, to have that promise to the members that this is what's going to happen if I get elected, Luis Figo is going to come, and then to go through all these, like, and then seeing the interviews that Figo would put out and say, I'm staying in Barcelona, posing with the shirt and all that stuff, and still remaining kind of like undeterred, like, we're going to find a way. It's there's a resilience to him, I think, and that's what makes him so successful at the club, and he's still there. And I'm just wondering, like, one of the things that struck me is that like what was going through Jose Veiga's mind when he signed that clause that he would have to pay 30 million if this didn't happen? How does he agree to that? And I'm just like, what are your personal thoughts on that?
I can't answer that question. Like, as Jose Veiga himself says, look, I was the number one agent back then. So he was a guy who wasn't really going to make big mistakes. And what I find so interesting is, and someone said this recently, is that everyone in the documentary seems surprised by what happened, except Florentino. And he's completely unflustered. I'm sure behind the scenes, he was, and one of the interesting characters we have is Jose Ramon de la Morena, who actually kind of... He's the only one who's kind of scolding Florentino a lot of the time and saying, no, you don't do it like that. You should do it like this. And that was really interesting. But you get this feeling that probably there was a lot of madness behind the scenes and Florentino was a bit more naive in those days. But it is this huge ballsy move. And yet he traps them all on what's quite a basic clause, really. It's not like it's kind of... he's just inserted a clause in the contract that says if this doesn't happen, then there will be a penalty. You know, that's not a mind-blowing clause. And maybe... there's part of you that wonders, and one of the reasons we brought in the sort of Italian background with Figo, that they'd signed contracts before. This feels like something they've done before, and it almost kind of like, yeah, you can sign a contract, but it'll be fine. And he's probably not going to get in. And I can't help feeling, and this is guessing, I can't help feeling that probably at the time there was a bit of a, look, this is a bit of free money. No one will ever find out about it. He's probably not going to get in. He's not going to be Lorenzo Sanz, who's just won 2 Champions Leagues in 3 years. Possibly there was something like that. Whether that pre-contract was legal, that's a whole different discussion. And one I definitely don't have the answer to. Whether it was something that had been able to fight with UEFA, or, afterwards, who knows? But definitely the penalty clause is the thing that makes the deal go through, I think, 100%.
It's basically what causes Veiga to panic and fly in a plane and go see Figo on his holidays and totally ruin the holidays for his family. It is a simple clause. Like, I mean, he did something similar with the Super League. Obviously, that hasn't panned out the way he had envisioned it, I guess. But this particular clause, I think, is not something necessarily completely unique in Florentino Perez's world. But I think I was more shocked at the severity of the penalty. That 30 million is a lot of money, especially back then. And I think it was the severity of it that, and I often wonder, like, what happens if Veiga just cannot convince Figo?
Yeah, he could go to jail. He'll go bankrupt. And I think these thoughts were really prevalent in all of their minds, in the three of them when they were in Sardinia in that sort of crucial, critical scene. But yeah, I think we were already in pre-production when the whole Super League thing happened, and we were kind of, and everyone was going, it's never going to happen. I was like, we're reading all this stuff right now. We're watching all this stuff. Florentino's got a plan here. He'll have them all with contracts, but I think obviously he probably underestimated how other countries would work. Can do it in Spain, but not necessarily in the UK.
Do you get the sense that over time he really was glad he made the transfer? Because there's the whole point being made in the documentary that, his first day, his presentation, he's just kind of like, his mind's not there. He doesn't look particularly happy. He's like, oh my God, what have I done? Half the country hates me now. Half the country admittedly loves me even more than they ever did. But there's a sense of did I make the right decision? He talks about it too. Did you get the sense that over time, he just kind of loved it? He loved the transfer. He loved the players. I was telling my wife this because I was trying to shove my own biased opinion in there, because she was like, he regrets it. Look, he's not happy. He should have stayed. And I said, no, look, see, that's Raul. He's running it. They formed a great relationship. They formed a great chemistry. They won titles together. Did you get a sense that it kind of just over time he kind of grew into it?
I think so. Yeah, it's hard, and the presentation is so powerful because you can see he is unhappy, and no other way about it. That is an unhappy guy, one of the things we always decided, we're going to start the film with him signing for Barcelona because he looks so unbelievably happy. It's a really interesting contrast. I think over time, Luis will have definitely convinced himself he made the right move, and he probably is right. You know, some of his closest friends still are those Real Madrid players. He lives in Madrid with his family. And I think sometimes, I remember hearing footballers say this before, those rivalries are never quite as big for the footballers as they are for the fans. And they can adapt quite quickly moving from one club to another club, because they're these hyper-competitive individuals. It's just about winning. So, you know, it might be the same if you're just in a local five-a-side league or something and you want to win it, and you move and play with another set of players. Okay, I'm playing with a better set of players now and I can win. And footballers almost have that slight mentality, I think, at times. So I think he'll have definitely convinced himself over the years it was the right move. And maybe, and it probably was. You know, he had a very successful time at Madrid. He lives in the city. He's made great friendships there. I'm sure he probably wouldn't have loved the way it did eventually all go down at Barcelona, and would have changed that if he could. But yeah, who knows?
So I wanted to ask you about I think you mentioned it was an interesting character. I believe his name is Jose Ramon am I getting that name right?
Jose Ramon de la Morena, yeah.
I thought one of the most shocking things I've heard in this whole documentary was the fact that he was so proud and admittant of the fact that he made up a story. And, you know, usually journalists try to conceal that side of things if they do that. Anything that struck you about him? He was definitely an interesting figure in this documentary.
Well, that was quite mad, because I think he says, to make the story bigger, I then said this, and I was thinking, story's already huge.
Yeah.
You don't need to make this bigger. And I think it's definitely had a bit of a reception in Spain, kind of like, oh God, this doesn't look good for our journalism. But it's, I think that whole scene of him sort of leaving, because he's at Lorenzo Sanz's daughter's wedding with Michel Salgado, and then he's breaking the news, you know, at the wedding of the guy's daughter. You're screwing him over at his daughter's wedding. And it was quite funny when we were discussing it one stage. We were sort of saying, if you're going to do that on the drive after the ceremony, I'm probably not going to go to the reception. But then he's still going to the reception, you know, and yeah, very different world. But yeah, he was a really interesting figure, and gives you, as I said earlier, sort of the one person who seems to have a little bit of control on Florentino, and a guy who we just couldn't translate. You know, I think our translation in English was kind of a broadcaster. You know, he's the radio presenter or was the radio presenter of El Larguero in Spain, one of those midnight shows. And the trouble is, if you sort of say a radio presenter, it kind of makes it quite, it's meaningless. But these guys are kind of kingmakers as well. You know, you have to, Lorenzo Sanz and Florentino Perez, as part of their election campaigns, have to get those guys on side. Those guys are crucial to kind of elevating them to the status they need to be. But I think that's the really fascinating thing, and the fortunate thing for our story was that the fact there were elections at both clubs meant we had all this archive to play with. Because we've had people in the UK going sort of, oh, you should do the same thing with Sol Campbell, who moved from Tottenham to Arsenal. But you just wouldn't have any archive around it beyond just a few sort of rumours. Whereas this, at least you're having two presidential elections. So these guys are having to answer questions about it every single day. And that the transfer was the central tenet of Florentino's election campaign.
Well, it's interesting because it seemed like Barcelona having their election that same summer was a huge disadvantage for them in this particular case, while for Real Madrid it was an advantage. And, you know, there's that quote, let me just bring it up, where Gaspard says publicly, where he says, if Figo signed with Real Madrid, there's nothing that can be done. And I think that was an interesting statement, because while that in that moment was true, I think it also ignores the fact that this was something that should have been dealt with in the summertime. Like, I don't think it's that difficult for Barcelona to retain Figo if they wanted to, you know, despite this Florentino thing. If they had just, because they told him, wait till elections are over. And I think Figo's quote in this was, he says, Gaspard acted like a nobody and I was pissed off. And I think if they just made the decision not to piss him off and I think deal with this earlier on before elections, they probably could have prevented this from happening.
I guess, but you sort of see it from Gaspart's point of view in this way that kind of, and Figo had a bit of form. He'd come to them before on kind of contract extensions. And you can see that kind of, look, I'm doing the elections. I'm still not elected, so I don't have the power yet. Just wait, and then we'll sort it out. So I can kind of see it from his point of view. Sure. I think the problem was that Figo didn't trust Gaspard. And so, and clearly there was a breakdown in communications between the presidency and the player. But I think that Barcelona era of Nunez and Gaspard, they were quite famous. I think that's where they really sort of make that more than a club into this slightly cultish philosophy that, you're playing for Barcelona. Don't worry about the money. That's what you sign up to. And if you don't want to sign up to that philosophy, we can get rid of you. If you think about it, in '97, they'd lost Ronaldo in similar circumstances. He had that brilliant season, '96 to '97. Inter Milan pays release clause. Nothing Barcelona can do. They're not going to increase his wages. He goes. '97, a lot of people don't know, Pep Guardiola very, very, very nearly left for Parma because he was similarly not feeling well respected enough, not getting paid enough. And it was only when that story came out and the Barcelona fans went crazy that they were like, oh God, we can't lose our local Catalan hero. We'll give Pep the money he needs and deserves. Figo had tried it a couple of times with AC Milan, I think in '97 and '99. So players were often looking for a bit of an escape. I think there seems to definitely be a disconnect in that Nunez Gaspard era where the presidency were they hadn't caught up with the market value of players. They hadn't quite realised that actually there was a lot of money in football now and players wanted to be paid at a certain level. And you needed more than just the sort of the cult of Barcelona and the cult of more than a club to retain these players.
Yeah, I think it's a fine balance because, as you said, I think you indirectly said basically there's no, and this is the case at Real Madrid too, where there's no one player bigger than the club, who gets to just have whatever they want no matter how big they are. But at the same time, I think, you brought up the Gaspard and Nunez era. I was revisiting recently the Bernd Schuster case, which he went from Barcelona to Real Madrid, and that was shocking as well. Obviously not as shocking as Luis Figo, but it was kind of similar circumstances where just did not see eye to eye with the president. The president publicly, called him out on some things. Obviously, Schuster was the ego himself, and then he left for Real Madrid. I think in both cases, Barcelona didn't see that it was Real Madrid who was going to be sweeping. I think they're more quote unquote happy to lose their player to somebody, but I don't think Gaspard, in the back of his mind, he's not thinking, okay, when I tell Figo wait until after elections, he's not expecting that it's Real Madrid that are the alternative, right? I think that probably it obviously caught everybody off guard. It was completely a ridiculous scenario. I was 13 at the time, and I was like, my mind was blown that this was possible. 20 years later, it's like, it wasn't, I didn't make it. It's not me that was making a big deal as a kid. It really, truly was earth-shattering stuff that was happening.
Well, it's so otherworldly, and I think it's this thought that at the time, and this was detail that we couldn't get into the documentary, but at the time, Lazio were very interested in signing Figo because they knew about his release clause, and I think his release clause was 10,000 million pesetas, whatever that works out as. It's probably about 30 million in today's currency. And Lazio kind of were like, nah, not at that price. We can't do that. And Lazio back then in 2000, they were the biggest spenders in world football. So the fact that Real Madrid, a club in massive debt, could come in, and for a Spanish club, the release clause was double. So it was 20,000 million pesetas, so 60 million euros. So I think it was so outlandish that, one, someone could pay that release clause, but then a Spanish club at double the price. It just didn't seem a possibility.
Right.
Yeah. I guess Florentino came in with his big financial plan and his use of image rights and these kind of things where he thought, no, I can sign these star players at astronomical sums. But yeah, I think it just, no one really, and that's again probably why you can see it from Gaspard's point of view. Why am I even going to give this any credibility? Because Real Madrid don't have that kind of money.
Yeah.
This new guy coming in doesn't have that kind of money, and they're never going to be able to pay this, pay this huge release clause.
I know we're running out of time, so I just had a couple more questions.
No worries. Yeah, go for it.
One is there anyone that you tried to get for this documentary that you couldn't and that you would have loved to have had? And is there anything that was left out of the doc that, obviously you have creative power over it, but is there anything that you kind of thought that was omitted that, would have been cool to see?
Let me think. We were lucky enough to pretty much get everyone we wanted. We did want to get Figo's wife, Helen, but she was reluctant to do. She's quite shy and felt quite reluctant talking on camera. So that was a shame because we thought that is actually one more person who was quite central to kind of conversations that no one would have known about at the time. Outside of that, in terms of players, no, we actually we did 5 or 6 other interviews that we actually cut out of the film. We interviewed people like Vicente del Bosque, Guillermo Amor, who was at Barcelona at the time, Jose Maria Minguea, one of the big kind of consigliere, I guess, at Barcelona. People like that, but they always felt a little bit at arm's length from the action, and we were very concerned that everyone in this documentary, the viewer needs to feel inside the room at every point. And that they are living this as it happened with the people who were there and were the first-hand witnesses. So I think that was super crucial for us, and we were really lucky to have that. And then to have that kind of smattering. So even the journalists, were involved in the story that we were using. So they're not just journalists giving kind of usual analysis. And that's the kind of documentary we wanted to avoid, because I think that's the usual way you'd play this. You'd have a few star names, you'd have a few players, you'd have a few journalists. Everyone would be analysing it, and we were like, no, we don't want anyone analysing it. We just want the story to unfold as it happened, and I think that's what keeps it exciting. In terms of what we left on the cutting room floor, probably loads of stuff, loads of really good archive, but yeah, loads of really good. We could have made Luis Figo look an even better player. There were some amazing goals he scored, but again, we didn't want to make it feel like some YouTube comp, and I think that's the beauty now of making these films. If you want to see Luis Figo as a player, you can jump on YouTube and watch a 10-minute compilation and realize how good he was. But for us, this was much more about what's the story here and what are we actually trying to say. So no, it was unbelievably smooth in terms of the production, in terms of everyone we got. So no, we were, and you could go on forever because you could go, right, let's get Ronaldo, let's get Zidane, let's talk about the Real Madrid period. But again, we were quite strict in cutting it off. This ends after the first return match, and then obviously we sum up sort of at the end. But otherwise, you can go on and on and on.
It's endless. It's endless. The things you could, the direction you could go from that documentary. It's endless, and
Well, as you said earlier as well, it's one of these things where we started as this is a documentary about a transfer. This is mainly about Figo, and then and then as I said, we had this heist movie feeling. But it's also an origin story of Florentino, as much as it is a story about Figo. I think it's the origins of how Florentino came to power at Real Madrid. And without that move, there would be no 14th Champions League.
Just you saying all that too, and I gotta ask. This is obviously from a selfish Real Madrid fan talking. What are the chances you could take this further and turn this into a series? Could you take it? Could you take over from this story and keep going? Is there any plans for that in the back of your mind to do more?
No, I don't think so. I think we're probably done with this story. I'm pretty sure there's already a production company out there doing a big kind of Galacticos series. So that'll be really interesting to see, especially having done this now. But no, I think I'll leave Real Madrid and Barcelona alone for a bit. I say now.
So what's next?
I don't know yet. I'm overseeing a couple of. I'm executive producing 2 or 3 projects. We've got a couple of big feature docs for Netflix again, but it's one on football, one on climbing, and then we've got 3 or 4 new films or series in development that sort of I'm loosely attaching myself to and hoping we can get greenlit within the next few months or so. But yeah, nothing concrete yet, but it's quite nice to just take a step back after when you do these things, they're kind of all encompassing for 18 months. So we've lived and breathed Figo for a full 18 months. So you need it. And before that, we did a film on Pele, which was about 3 years. So I think it's nice just to have a chance to take a step back.
Well, congratulations. I mean, the documentary, everyone I've spoken to really enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. We're going to do, this is part 1 of the podcast. Part 2, we're going to continue talking about the things we loved about the documentary with some of the staff. And if you haven't watched it already, please go watch it, because you're out of your mind, to be quite honest. If you haven't watched it yet, it's so much fun. It's great. If you live through the era, it'll be nostalgic. You'll learn new things. And if you haven't, well, it's a great introduction to the whole saga and how it happened, in the most detailed and I think accurate and most pieced together version of the story we've ever had. So would encourage everyone to go watch it. David, thanks for sparing a little bit of your time on this podcast. It was awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem at all. Thank you so much for having me on. It was fun.
All right, this is part 2. This is more kind of, I guess, raw discussion, our thoughts on everything that happened during the Figo saga and the documentary as we lived it, relived it, and all that stuff. And Matt is here. Matt, how you doing? It's been a while.
Hey again, yeah, I'm doing well. It's been a little while since you and I last caught up, but I'm excited about this one. Just rewatched the documentary again this morning, so I've seen it twice now, and so I'm ready to go. I'm excited to talk about this.
This was before your fandom, right?
Yes, it was. So it was really interesting for me to see this all unfold and watch. Like, there was a lot I didn't realize. So this was just before I became a fan, which was around 2003 when Beckham joined.
So I took notes on this chronologically throughout the documentary. I thought we could tackle it that way, and obviously whatever you want to jump in with, jump in. It starts with the scenes of the first game back when Figo returns to the Camp Nou with Real Madrid. And even though I had seen footage before, even though that particular game, I think, wasn't on live in Canada. We listened to it through Cadena Ser radio, me and my dad. So we were just hearing what was happening and, like, you know, things being thrown, the game being delayed. Like, throughout the game, they had to stop it. And the description of Puyol running to the fans, telling them to stop, and all the stuff that was happening. It was a surreal scene. Even still seeing it again, even though I've seen it, was still just incredible scenes.
Yeah, what I was watching was, like, I was looking at specific fans in the stands and just, like, looking at their faces, looking at what they were saying, like, just focusing on specific people rather than maybe looking at Figo or the things that were thrown at him, and just, like, the pure rage and disgust from everyone. And maybe that's one of my few criticisms of the documentary, was, like, I felt like it didn't even truly capture the vitriol. And so Barcelona fans went over the line in that game. Like, this was the worst we've ever seen, like, chanting death to him and his family. And it's just like, you cross the line at that point. And I think Pep Guardiola said it in the documentary. He's like, on that night, the Barcelona fans crossed the line. But yeah, I just felt like, you see these images, they're insane, but I felt like even then it didn't fully capture it.
I gotta say, like, there are definitely lines that get crossed in these things. The one thing that I could just never, ever understand, you have to be a sick kind of human to do it. When you start getting family members involved, that's just disgusting. Like,
or death chants, like, that's ridiculous. Yeah. Like, how do you get to that level?
Like, me personally, I could probably tolerate people telling me to go die or whatever. For me personally. But if you talked about my family, my wife, my kids, or anyone else, that's just, it made me physically sick to see scenes like that. And there are a couple things that, you know, I remember reading, and this wasn't in the documentary. At some point, Salgado actually goes to Figo and says, maybe you should stop taking corners. And obviously Figo, being the guy he is, and he expressed it in the documentary, like, it would be cowardly for me not to play this game. And so, you know, you want to say hello really quick? Yeah. You got to be very quick, because we're having a very important discussion. You can say, Hala Madrid.
Hala Madrid.
Hala Madrid. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so That was an appearance from Luca. You want to sit here? Okay. So, yeah, I mean, and then there was one point, the one thing that I did read eventually was that Xavi actually comes out and says that Figo shouldn't have provoked the fans. And I remember my blood boiling when I read that quote. But yeah, I mean, just the entire night was surreal.
Yeah. And I think I was kind of thinking that myself, like when you see all the bottles being thrown, the cans, everything, like I was thinking to myself, should Figo really be the one taking the corner kicks at this point? Like, shouldn't someone else? So it's interesting that Salgado made that point. But Hierro called it out in the documentary. He's like, it's just not Figo's personality. He's not going to say no to that type of stuff. He's going to take it on. And like all things considered, Figo handled it really, really well.
I mean, as bad as you can handle it. I mean, that's about as much vitriol you'll get just for playing football. And yeah, he went through it, I think, better than I could imagine anyone else would have done so in that case. What struck you like as this wore on? And I mentioned this to in part one to David, but I thought the relationship between Pep and Figo was super interesting. And because I knew that they were teammates, obviously, but I didn't know that they were that close. Roommates, sitting on the bus together, like sitting together to eat. They were so close. And you could tell, like, Matt, it really broke Pep. Like, it broke his heart, like the whole thing, how it went down. He was really genuinely sad about it.
Yeah, you're right. That was one of the standout kind of takeaways for me as well. It was like, wow, it was a true bromance. And like you said, even if you notice like on the plane, the clips of them on the plane and stuff, they're always sitting together. And that's what I liked about this documentary is like you got snippets into kind of the more background and deeper into it. Like even you had clips of Figo at 22 years old driving around in Lisbon, and clips of Figo in Sardinia on vacation with his family, like home video. Even Pep at his daughter's birthday party, like second birthday party. So like stuff like that you would never, we just never seen before. And so to have access to that, to see that was probably one of my biggest takeaways and favorite things about this documentary.
I thought of you when it went to Roberto Carlos and he was talking about him. And I think one of the things that there's an entire separate documentary that can be made about how freaking good Luis Figo was. Like, truly, I actually think, and I'm not saying this because of this documentary made me think of it, but I've thought about this over the past, like, literally 20 years all the time. I think he's an underrated player. At one point, he was the de facto best player in the world. Like, you can argue about, like, you know, Ronaldo Nazario at that time. Obviously, he got injured for a couple years. Then you had Zidane, who at least 1 or 2 years, he has a case for being the best player in the world. But Figo really was the most unstoppable player in the world at one point. And I think even though his peak was at Barcelona, I would argue his very first season at Real Madrid may have been also his best year as a footballer. The true unstoppable nature of him was something to behold. And one thing that struck me about this documentary was when Roberto Carlos comes in and he says that, like, it was a nightmare having to defend him. And he literally says it was impossible to mark him. I thought about you because, you know, obviously we're huge Roberto Carlos fans and, you know, by extension, we're also pretty big Figo fans too because kind of a same time frame. We got to see them at their peaks. But that quote was pretty powerful, I thought.
Well, I love after they show that quote or after they kind of interview Roberto Carlos and he says that quote, they cut to a scene where Figo's it's 1v1 versus Roberto Carlos. Figo cuts in outside the box and rips a shot top corner with his left foot, like unbelievable shot in the Clásico at Camp Nou, and just goes off celebrating. And it just went to show you how good he was. And for someone like me, so like when I think about Figo and just when my fandom started, I felt like not that he was overhyped, but I just didn't think he was like, I'd always heard about he was one of the best players in the world. And like we have Figo, Zidane, Raul, Roberto Carlos, Ronaldo, Beckham. And I never really got to see that elite level of Figo. And even like Euro 2004, like he wasn't fully that Figo that you see in these clips. And oh my God, what a player he was. When you see him just cutting in, hitting those shots, goal after goal, like they had a lot of great like peak Figo sequences in this documentary. And it gave me a newfound appreciation for just how good he was.
We don't have like advanced analytics for him, but I'd love to see the numbers on his like dribbling success rate, how many times he's dribbled to pass his opponents. Because I remember like there was no one I would literally bet my life on. If he was taking on a defender, he was going to beat him. Like he was dribbling past players at will. It was like just incredible stuff to see him go down that right wing, sometimes switching over to the left, cutting in. You never knew which way he was going to dribble, whether he was going to cut inside or outside. He was truly a force. It also brought me back. His hairstyle it's just a wall of gel. Like it just goes up and it's like just a brick wall. And I remembered that my entire childhood, like when I was like a preteen, basically, my hairstyle was that because of him. He was like my idol.
Awesome.
Like
that's awesome.
It was just groups of gel, like unheard of amount of gel that would just go and spike my hair up. I know it's crazy to look at my head now and think that, but that's what I styled my hair after him. What was your take on just Joan Gaspart and how he was portrayed in this documentary, and whether he is at fault? How much of this was his fault and how much of this was out of his control, do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's 5 key figures in this whole deal, in this whole documentary, and Gaspard for sure is one of them. And I think he took for granted what he had. He took for granted Figo. He took for granted this whole operation. And he, like so many others, felt it was impossible. But I think it was kind of a perfect storm for Florentino and on the Real Madrid side, because I think this can be overlooked in the documentary, but they call it out pretty quick, that this was both clubs were having elections at the same exact time, which doesn't normally happen. So both clubs were in a period of potentially transitioning and changing their president. And that, because of that, I think it gave Real Madrid and Florentino an advantage, because on the day Gaspard gets elected and he's out celebrating, Figo, that's the day that Florentino and Paulo Futre and Veiga are all negotiating for Figo to finally sign that contract. And so while he's out celebrating, dancing with his wife, and they even have video of this within the documentary, he gets a call from Figo and basically an ultimatum, whether now all of this documentary is like what you choose to believe and what you don't. And so some Figo will say that never happened. But like, think about it. Think about it if you're in Gaspard's shoes, like you're celebrating, you're happy, like you're not dealing with this tonight. You're not getting a bank certificate or whatever he asked for tonight. Like, these are problems that can be handled later, but tonight you're celebrating. It's part of a win, and no player's contract's getting renewed. Like, there's time for that. And I just think he didn't have that sense of urgency that Florentino did and the rest of the team, and he didn't recognize what Figo wanted, which was, at the end of the day, to be valued, to be cared for, to be shown that this project is about him, to show that Barcelona will be and will continue to be one of the best teams in the world, and what they're doing to build this project around him and how much they value him, which is what Florentino did. And so I think that's the big difference, and it really comes down to Gaspard's arrogance and the fact that it was election time for both of them.
I've been thinking about this a lot too, like what he could have done differently. And I think in a lot of ways, even though he wasn't the greatest president, like by the end of the documentary, there's like a line where he says, "I was like the worst president in Barcelona history," or something like that. It's like your heart kind of sinks, like, oh man, poor guy. It's just like, he's so demoralized over this whole thing. He really comes out looking at as like kind of I don't know. I don't think like he was portrayed in the greatest light, but at the same time, he at least came off like he looked like he he really felt like he failed, not just about Figo, but just in general as a Barca president. You can see the sadness in his eyes when the Culés in the Camp Nou are asking him to resign towards the end of the documentary and all that stuff. But I was thinking about like what he can do differently. And I think in some ways I sympathize with him in that he is right that he has to like go through the election process first. And when someone comes at you like during this whole thing and asks for money, and obviously, you know, everyone has their own truth to this, and you can kind of, and I mentioned this to David, the kind of cool thing about this documentary, I think each viewer will come to their own conclusion about what the truth was. I think it kind of goes back to like, you know, I don't think if this version of Florentino in 2022, if a player like was coming at him like during an important time, whether it's the elections or something else, and he's asking for more money or I'm out, I think Florentino now would be probably have kind of a similar reaction to Gaspard and be like, see you later. You know, I don't care who you are. Like, I'm not paying you, whether you're Ramos, Ronaldo, or whoever. And so I wonder how it would differ now. Obviously, Florentino then was like, Figo is literally my ticket to win the election, so I'm going to push for it. But if I'm Gaspard, what I would have done is, I think the very least he could have done is be like, hey, Luis, I'm going through this right now. We'll deal with it later. But I did want to tell you that you are probably the best player in the team. We value you tremendously. I think that would have been the bare minimum that he could have done. Because this was, whether it's his fault or Barcelona's fault as an institution in the elections before Gaspard, they failed to value him before this entire saga happened. You know, he was not happy. So I think that this would have been preventable had they been able to value him like a couple years before this incident. I think they could have stopped this.
Yeah, I agree. I think at the end of the day, like, it's what I know Barcelona fans think it all came down to money, but I don't think that's what it all came to. Obviously, Figo was elated and probably he said it like he was blown away that Real Madrid was offering 4 times as much as he was making at Barcelona. But at the end of the day, that night in Sardinia, what convinced him was the project that Florentino was sharing with him and basically how much he valued him and the urgency that they had. And he convinced him on what was going to be the go forward plan. And I just don't think Gaspard really had any of those types of conversations with Figo, and he just didn't feel like he had that. And so that for me, that's ultimately what came down to the decision that Figo made. And like, he just felt like he said in the documentary, it was a selfish decision, and like, but it was the right decision for him.
Well, the other thing that Gaspard did was that he publicly came out and said that he's not going to improve Figo's contract. And I think that there should have been some more wisdom in dealing with that and not taking it public like that. Figo's direct quote was, Gaspard acted like I was a nobody and I got pissed off. He just said I was pissed off. And I think there was definitely some spite in it as well, in the decision as well. And look, like, if I have Luis Figo in my team at his peak, one of the greatest players of all time, you know, I'm probably not going to try to piss him off and take things public. And, you know, I'm going to try to like, okay, I want to keep this guy, you know. So I definitely put some, at the very least, some blame on Gaspard. I remember a couple years ago, I think it was maybe more, Diego Lorin wrote an article for Barca Blaugranas, and he got so much vitriol from Barca fans. And I think eventually that was his last article. That was like the last straw or whatever. But Barca fans hated him because he basically wrote an entire article saying it was Barca's fault that Figo left, and we can't label him as the mercenary or whatever because we could have prevented this. I definitely think there was an element of truth to that. Like, you know, this whole, we know this. We can kind of detach ourselves from, you know, not being biased Barca fans. We are just literally Real Madrid fans. We are objective about this. The whole Mescu and Club thing has always been BS. It has obviously political reasonings for that statement. But this whole thing of like moral superiority and all this has always been BS. They have not treated their players well. during that whole era, they didn't treat under Nunez and Gaspard, they didn't treat their players well. They didn't value them properly. They threw them under the bus regularly, just the way Bartomeu did. And so, as an institution, I definitely think over the years they should have done better jobs at keeping their players happy and valuing them.
Well, one more quick thing on this is like, at the end of the day, Barcelona had a huge advantage, and Gaspard had a huge advantage over Florentino. It was like being 3-0 up at halftime because Figo wanted to stay at Barcelona. He said that over and over and over again. He gave all those interviews, and like his end goal was to stay at Barcelona with an improved contract. That's all he really wanted, and to feel valued. So the ball was in their court. Like if they truly wanted to keep him, Diego's right. They could have kept him. Like everything was in their favor, yet they failed to capitalize on all those things, and Florentino just persisted, and he never doubted. He never stopped believing, and that's what was incredible watching this. Is just Florentino's confidence and his ability to just persist and believe no matter what kind of adversarial subjects or different things came into play.
What was your read on this Jose Ramon de la Morena cat? One of the weirdest guys. A strange character, interesting character. What was your take?
Yeah, he's apparently like, it's apparently not surprising that he made up that Florentino would pay for all the season ticket holders or the socios. Apparently that wasn't surprising that he would just kind of add that fake piece of journalism in there because
and seemingly proud of it, like he was like boasting about it in the documentary. Like
that, apparently that's like his type. That's how he's known in Spain, of being that type of individual. And it was just the fact that, and this is something else like I had no idea about. I don't know if you were aware of this, having kind of been more in tune with it during that time, but like this was all going on at Lorenzo San's daughter and Michel Salgado's wedding. They were getting married, and this is all going on, and De La Morena gets in the car and feels like he has to break the news, and so he breaks the news while they're all driving from the ceremony to like the reception area. And so Lorenzo Sanz and Florentino Perez are all freaking out during this wedding ceremony. And it's just, I mean, you can only imagine like the stress that Lorenzo Sanz must have been under on that day. And he's like, you're really going to do this today?
Poor Lorenzo Sanz, man. Rest in peace. God bless him. He was a good president and a good man. And I think my mind was just racing during the whole thing because I was thinking about the journalism side of this. That you can get away with, like, as far as things you can get away with, like, that's got to be pushing the limits of the limits. To piss off basically two presidents at one of the president's wedding, and just, I don't know whether to call it courageous or dumb, or quite frankly, it's just really unethical, to be honest. But that's the side of things I was thinking about, like, how can you be boasting about this? I mean, it seemed like he was proud of the fact that he was able to stir this up. Jose Veiga, the pre-contract. My take on that, it seemed like this whole debate about, Figo didn't sign it. Obviously, it turns out he didn't. But I don't know if it was done in complete secrecy. Like, I don't think it was like... I don't know if it was... I guess what I'm trying to say is I think Figo basically told them, do what you got to do and make an executive decision on this. But I don't think Figo obviously knew that what it ultimately came down to was Veiga promised 30 million if Figo didn't go. I'm sure Figo didn't know about that part. I'm sure Figo knew about some clause or whatever, but there's no way he knew that was the ramifications of it.
I completely agree. I think that's what it came down to. I think Figo said, okay, you handle it. I trust you. But I think Veiga he got those dollar signs in his eyes, and he realized like, oh my God, this could be the deal, the biggest deal I ever do. And he didn't want to let it go. And what I didn't realize, I mean, Jose Veiga, like he's one of those 5 key actors, obviously. And I didn't realize this, that basically Figo had deals with Juventus and was it Palermo? And
Parma,
obviously, or Parma. And Serie A was the league at that time, and obviously that's where everybody wanted to go. And Veiga ended up signing deals with both, and so Figo couldn't. Long story short, Figo couldn't go to either team. And so that was like foreshadowing what was to come in Veiga's career, and kind of like almost his MO. Like I wouldn't put it past him to do, I don't know if you want to call it shady things, but like negotiate deals, say terms are agreed, deals agreed, and then still on the back end have not talked to his client or worked things out or whatever it may be, like agree with all 3 parties. And so, yes, I 100% believe there was a pre-contract. I 100% believe there was that 30 million penalty clause. I do believe that Figo was somewhat aware of it, but I agree with you. I don't think he knew of that clause. And that's ultimately what drove Veiga, and I know we'll get to him, the biggest character in all of this, Paulo Futre. That's ultimately what drove them to the ends of the earth and to do everything possible to make this deal happen.
I was just thinking about the cost-benefit analysis. Because the commission wasn't that much to cancel out 30 million. You know what I mean? Like the commission, I think, was 6 million, but he wasn't even getting the full 6 million of that. I think because I think Futre was getting some of it, and all I could think about was, how could you sign that from your perspective? Because the risk was insane. Like, how would you agree to that penalty? You know what I mean? Because if you're Florentino, obviously, good for him to convince him to do that. Unbelievable Jedi mind tricks. But how do you put your name on that? That's terrifying.
Yeah, man, I don't know what the thought process is. I'm trying to justify it in my head. I think the only thing is, like, maybe Florentino said, like, if Figo is going to get this deal, if you want this deal, like this type of salary, all of these whatever extra bonuses that are included, like, then this is the penalty clause. Otherwise, no negotiating, no deal, no nothing. That's the only way I could see it working out.
It was a stroke of genius either way. That, I mean, it's, and I told David this in part 1, that I didn't necessarily learn. I went into this documentary thinking I wouldn't learn anything new, and I didn't to some extent. But the biggest new stuff in here was the Jose Veiga stuff, because this is the first time he had spoken.
Did you know about Paulo Futre?
I didn't know the Paulo Futre part. No, that was the whole new thing too. I mean,
yeah,
I knew that there was connections with Futre and Figo, and I knew that Figo loved Futre growing up. I didn't know he would have been one of the main protagonists for sure. Yeah. No, I didn't know.
No, for me, that was the biggest, first off, I think Futre is probably the most important person in all of this, because there's so many domino effects. So many domino effects from his actions. But I'll say this. I think Florentino, you want to talk about stroke of genius? Stroke of genius for Florentino to first go to Paulo Futre, not the agent, not Figo himself, not any family members. He goes to Paulo Futre, who Figo identified with. It was his role model. All young Portuguese players looked up to Paulo Futre. He was the man for Portuguese football for so many years. And so Florentino Perez chooses him to go to first. I think that was just a brilliant masterstroke. And then for Paulo Futre to fake a phone call because he recognized what was potentially on the table here, I think that's like, if he didn't do that, this deal maybe never materializes. But he there's so many dominoes that he puts into play within this whole transfer that unbelievable. There's just so many little things that happen, and he is such a eccentric, just charismatic guy, and just I feel like everybody knows a Paulo Futre in their life. Like talks with their hands, super animated, just hilarious. I think he'd be the life of the party anywhere he goes. He was just such a character.
He was a fun part of the doc. If you think about what it took also, when Futre calls Veiga initially, Veiga was like, don't call me, this is nonsense. Like, what you're saying that's not real. Like, stop. Imagine what it would have been like if Florentino had called him, who was nobody knew him at that point. Some guy who's not even Real Madrid president yet. No one even knows him. He's trying to compete against the guy who's won 2 Champions League titles in 3 years. There's no way. Like, even Veiga almost shut down Futre, like, on the spot. Which brings me to my next point, because I was thinking a lot about this after the documentary too. As you know, I have a whole section in my book about pivotal moments in club history and what ifs. And I was thinking, like, do I have to add this? Because I guess the what if would be, what happens if Florentino doesn't contact Paulo Futre? What happens in the next 22 years? If he can't sign Figo, he doesn't get elected. Everything's different. No Zidane, no Ronaldo, no Beckham. Sanz was a good person, but had no grasp on the financial side of things. The club was in huge debt with him in president, even though it was successful on the pitch to some extent. I don't know what this looks like without Figo becoming a Real Madrid player.
It's funny you bring this up because literally in my notes for like discussion points to talk about tonight, I have what if Figo ended up staying at Barcelona? What are the domino effects of that? And would we still go on to sign all those guys you mentioned, Zidane, Ronaldo, Beckham? Like, who knows? Who knows at the project? You don't think so?
If Florentino wasn't the president.
Well, what if he did get elected but just didn't sign Figo?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know.
Yeah. So, yeah, I do think like it's a huge domino effect, and it's funny because I think this was in the documentary, or maybe I saw it somewhere else. But Florentino Perez says he always says to Figo when he sees him, "You're the one that started it all. You were the first one. You're the one that started it all."
It's funny, like there's 3 players who, because what essentially it's 2 things that are happening at once. Not only do you sign arguably the best player in the world at the time, I mean, he won Ballon d'Or that same year, but you also took him away from the rivals. You destroyed your opponent and became an immediate Champions League title contender for the next 4 or 5 years, basically. Even though Figo declined really, but 2003, 2004, he wasn't the same. But then there's more people coming in. My point is, this has happened like 3 times, at least off the top of my head in the history of Barcelona and Real Madrid. In the late 80s, Schuster goes from Barcelona to Real Madrid. All of a sudden, Real Madrid win back-to-back league titles. The pendulum shifts. Michael Laudrup beats Real Madrid 5-0 with Barcelona. The next year goes to Real Madrid and then beats Barcelona 5-0 with Real Madrid. And then you had this whole Figo thing, which, they didn't win that first Clásico with him back, but they won the title. There was a clear shift. Barcelona, I think it was mentioned in the doc, went trophyless for 5 or 6 years or something like that. Whatever it was. There's just shifts. Now I'm just kind of waiting. Who's the next person?
Well, I think they made the parallel in the documentary that this transfer was equivalent, and it's not saying that Figo was this good, but just in terms of like the perception, the perception of Real Madrid and Barcelona fans of like how was this actually feasible was it'd be like Messi going from Barcelona to Real Madrid. And so when you put it into those terms, I think like fans who maybe weren't familiar with Figo or like just weren't fans at that time, like you can understand the magnitude of this transfer and just what took place. And the thing that like rattles my brain and like going through it during the time is like all the interviews Figo gave where he just said, I'm going to be a Barcelona player. I'm staying. I've made my decision. Like he was on the cover. he did a couple, and one where like he talked to, I think it was Mundo Deportivo, and said he was going to stay, and then Florentino freaked out, and so then he did an interview with Marca the next day saying, "Oh, I don't know, maybe." But then when he was in Sardinia on his vacation, about to return from preseason, Euro 2000 was over, he does an interview with Sport where he says, "I will not leave Barca. That is my final decision." So for him to end up being presented at the end of this documentary with Florentino Perez, Alfredo Di Stefano holding up a Figo 10 Real Madrid jersey is just insane to think about from like the fan point of view, and just this transfer always seemed impossible, and even more so with Figo's direct quotes, and yet it still happened. So my question to you, Kiyan, is like, one, will we ever see a transfer like this again? And two, is this in terms of just like all the different, just everything surrounding this transfer, is this the greatest transfer of all time? Not in terms of like player quality and like how he performed, but just like the ability to pull this off. Is this the greatest transfer of all time?
The greatest coup, like, you know.
Coup, yeah.
Yeah.
I think for me it is.
I think the degree of difficulty, yes. Definitely.
Yeah, degree of difficulty. That's the question here.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
I think it's number one. I think in terms of like breaking the internet, Neymar to PSG was pretty crazy, I remember. But it wasn't nearly
this would have surpassed this.
But it wasn't like this. This was something that I don't know will be followed up again in my lifetime. I'm trying to think of what the modern day parallel would be now. It would be like,
I do think it is like Messi going to Real Madrid.
I think it's pretty close. The difference is like Messi is arguably the greatest player of all time, top 2, top 1, wherever you want to put him. Figo didn't have that. It wouldn't be quite so. Figo, it's not quite that. Like Messi going to Real Madrid would be bigger than Figo going to Barcelona.
Oh yeah,
Real Madrid, you know
yeah.
what I mean? That's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to think of like what the parallel would be. I think it would be like, I don't know. It could be like something like Ronaldinho. No, not even Ronaldinho. Because like Figo was really entrenched in Catalan culture. He was like, he hated Real Madrid. Like he
dyed his hair in Blaugrana colors in their celebration.
I don't know if it's kind of hard to find a parallel of who would be like it would. I don't know, but I think it might be controversial to say, and maybe I'm naive. I don't know, but because he said in the documentary that that is how he felt at the time when he was giving those interviews to Sport and stuff. I actually believe him. I actually really feel like
I do.
I don't think he was lying. I think that's genuinely how he felt at the time.
Yeah.
But then things just happened so fast, and then Veiga's freaking out because he's going to owe 30 million. And I don't know. They didn't say this part of the doc, but I wonder how much of this was like Figo deep down was like, man, if I don't go, then Veiga owes 30 million and is going to go in prison. Do I want to have that on my conscience, or is that his problem, not mine? Like, I wonder how much you thought of that.
I don't know if that plays a role or not. Because who knows? Do you think Veiga actually told him? I don't know. What I think is like,
I don't know.
What I think is one of the most decisive things, along with this is why I think Paulo Futre is like the most important character in all of this. Because not only does he fake that phone call initially, but he's the one that tells Veiga, all right, we're going. Because Figo said, no. He called him on the phone and said, I'm not going. Like, just downright denying it. And so Veiga says, or Paulo Futre says to Veiga, all right, let's get on a plane. We're going to Sardinia, and we're going to go talk to him in person. Mm-hmm. And like Veiga, that wasn't Veiga's idea. That was Paulo Futre. And they followed Figo out onto the beach in their suits. Just that image alone makes me crack up. And they stayed with him all night. Like, the decision wasn't made until 3 a.m. Florentino eventually gets flown in there. And the biggest thing too, which like I think is incredible, is like they finally start persuading him, and it looks like he's gonna say yes. And then he calls his wife at like 3 a.m, and Paulo Futre just says has this image. He talks about this image of Figo on the phone, just saying yes, 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 and sinking deeper and deeper into his chair. And basically, his wife said, "No way in hell are we leaving Barcelona. No way are we moving." And so, that for this still to happen after that, like, I mean, anybody who has in a committed relationship or has a committed partner or is like developed a family, like, Kiyan, think about it. If your wife said, "No way are we doing this," like, no, 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 then you can't, it's going to be, if you don't have everybody on board, if you don't have, it's a family decision, then it's going to be almost impossible to do this. And you're already trying to convince him. Like, it's not like he's sold on this 100%. And so for this deal still to happen after that and to eventually convince his wife as well, like that, I think Paulo Futre is the most important character in all of this.
Yeah, I think he's probably number 2 after Florentino, I'd say. Yeah, look, I don't think it was easy for him. I don't think even just the way they described how it was like one of the hardest days to be like trying to be on holiday, and it's just a nightmare for your wife and kid who are just trying to enjoy themselves, and then have to break the news to your wife, and it's not really going down well. I think I understand the stress that was in his head during the presentation. You know what I mean?
So I couldn't help during this whole documentary but think about the Mbappe saga. Does this change how you feel about Mbappe in that saga at all?
The Mbappe thing is completely different because it was the inverse. Whereas, because Mbappe felt the opposite of Figo in that he wanted to come.
But what I'm saying, but you saw the pressure that Figo was under. You saw how he basically changed. He was set on Barcelona, 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 and then one day it shifted. And even giving that interview, much like Kylian Mbappe giving his word to Florentino Perez on that weekend, and then all of a sudden on Wednesday he changed his mind. I don't know, it kind of changed my perception on it. I was just like, these are people's lives. They're getting, if you can make the case, and if Al Khalifi and the Emir of Qatar and all the president of France and all these people are pressuring you, and you're having one of those days where you're all in a room, and PSG were able to kind of lock him down and just continue to say, this is the project, this is what we'll do, we'll give you this, this, and this. And it's basically what Florentino did with Veiga and Paulo Futre, to convince Figo. So I kind of I don't know, I have more sympathy towards it now than I did before.
I think, objectively speaking, Mbappe has the right to do what he wants. I understand completely why fans are so upset with him, and were upset with him, and will be, and I think a lot of fans will not forgive him. I think in 2 years when this whole thing happens again, there's going to be a lot of fans be like, F this guy, this is what he did. And I understand that completely. I think, objectively speaking, as a human being, not as a sports fan, not as someone who is a fan of any club or whatever, just as someone who wants to have a financially successful career and considers what his parents or family or whatever wants, and the pressure, yeah, there is definitely a level of understanding there, I suppose. But my point was always at what point does money become too much money and starts trumping where you're happy to play? And that's a question I think only he can answer. I think, but yeah, I do think we do tend to forget the human side of things a lot as fans. You saw it in the documentary. In what world is it okay to start calling someone's wife a terrible word, degrading comments, bringing your kids into it, talking about death? Sports fans are crazy. And obviously, we saw a lot of the ugly side of things during the Mbappe thing as well. But could you imagine if Twitter was around for this whole Figo thing?
Yeah.
Not only the first game back, but also just the saga itself. In the 24 hours they went on holiday, on Figo's holiday. The one day the interview in Sport, the next day the interview in Marca. People would be losing their minds.
Yeah,
and Real Madrid and Barcelona fans would hate each other by the end of it.
Oh my God. Yeah, it would be do you think his return to the Camp Nou would be even worse today? Because of that? Because of social media?
I think social media would have hyped it up even worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
I think just kind of transitioning here, I think one thing that stood out to me and what I really liked about this documentary, when they basically introduced Florentino Perez really late into it. Like he's not interviewed for the first 40 minutes or so, if not more than that. And then like the way they kind of introduce him, and he still has this aura about him even when he's introduced. And what I liked seeing in all these clips of like young Florentino is just his almost like brashness and like just unwavering confidence. And like he's almost got the arrogance of like, you would think he's this young buck, like a 30 or 40-year-old guy like running for president who's just like bringing all these fresh new ideas and these. No, he's like early 50s. Like this is not like Florentino's super young, but like it's just the vibe he gives off. He just looked like a politician to me. Yeah. Like, saying the right things, being confident, shaking everyone's hand. He said all the right things. Yeah. The way he sits down, I think his first line is hilarious because they're talking about what's the truth, and his line is, "I'm telling the truth because I'm the protagonist." Yeah. I thought that was hilarious. That's pure Florentino, I feel like, too. That was awesome. Let me see. What else do you want to talk about? Did we miss anything? Let me look at my notes. I guess the one thing that I get it, like I get why. Oh yeah, I have two more things I want to talk about. But one, I get why they didn't show much of this, but just because like the whole documentary obviously is surrounded about the transfer. But I just wish they showed a little bit more on Real Madrid and his time at Real Madrid. Yeah. I felt like that was quickly glossed over. Yeah. And so from that point of view, I that's a criticism I have. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is if you put yourself back in those shoes, or like, let's say the Lorenzo Sanz, Florentino Perez election was happening today, and you were hearing all these things Florentino said, and obviously Lorenzo Sanz denying it, Figo comes out, denies it, like all this different stuff. Which way do you think you would have sat? Would you have like wanted the socios to vote for Florentino, or would you have preferred Lorenzo Sanz? Like not knowing that Figo was going to sign, just kind of having all the background information that was going on that you saw in the documentary. That's interesting. I'll quickly go through the pros and cons. I think Sanz was, in a sense, like a respectable president. And I probably would have leaned towards him because he was more of a known quantity. And I think when someone comes in as brash as Florentino and has these promises while Figo is denying it, it's a red flag. I think I would have leaned towards Sanz. Obviously, not knowing what was about to come. So the other thing too is Lorenzo Sanz just won 2 Champions Leagues as well. Like, I think the only thing we both probably would have been worried about would be like the financial situation. But I don't know. Like, it would be good to get Eduardo's take, because it'd be interesting to see like how many socios were really worried about that at the time. But and like how much was that actually being discussed in the media and different things. But I think I would have leaned Lorenzo Sanz because I just wouldn't have believed what Florentino Perez was saying. I would just be like, oh, this is just some guy who's trying to get elected.
Yeah, or just trying to get attention.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I would have leaned towards Sans. Yeah. Unless I really, really understood how bad of a financial situation the club was in, and then I saw this guy who is, okay, ambitious, successful businessman, knows how to deal with money, I would have maybe thought about it differently, but, you know, I was 13 at the time. But maybe if I had more information on that, I would have been. But again, because he was an unknown quantity, I probably would have leaned Sans for sure.
Yeah. Do you think? How do you think Barcelona fans view Figo after watching this documentary? Do you think anything's changed?
That's interesting. I don't know. If I was a Barca fan, I would probably have more sympathy for him after this.
Yeah, I would. I definitely would. And like, I think it goes back to our discussion on Gaspard. Like, I think they would agree if they went back and now read Diego's piece. They probably would agree with that. I actually might go look at Diego's piece after this because I just want to read and see if he like brought out all these points.
If it's still up on the website, I think they basically banned him after that.
Oh wow, really? Jeez. But yeah, I think, and like I've talked to friends who aren't Real Madrid or Barcelona fans, and basically one of their big takeaways as well was just how cool Florentino Perez is, and how calm and cool and confident he is, and like just the way he believed no matter what throughout the whole thing. I loved watching Florentino, and this, it was just it was peak Florentino.
What's interesting is also this has always been the case with Florentino. He doesn't like have any animosity towards Barca or its presidents. He's always like, I mean, now you obviously see it in a different scale too because of the Super League and him defending Laporta in public and telling La Liga to like lay off their financial situation and stop telling them who to sign and all this. But there's that scene also when the reporters talking like between him and Gaspard together. He's always just kind of like laughing about the whole situation, and Gaspard's like really angry.
Yeah,
and
but I think that speaks to Florentino's character and his class, because like he's always, one thing that I've always respected about Florentino and like what the club does is they always try to maintain good relationships, or at least respectful relationships with everyone. And like he was friends with Gaspard at the end of the day, like they were friends. And despite this whole thing happening, like that tells you the type of person Florentino is. And I think for the most part, like what made me feel pride during the Bartomeu era was like how they were just burning bridges with every club, and every club was saying how like they were a nightmare to deal with, and like they won't negotiate with them again, and things of that nature. While Real Madrid and Florentino in particular has always made it a point to kind of keep things professional, classy, maintain those good relationships.
Keep
and
emotions
so I think,
out of it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that again stands out in this, because to your point, like in that scene where they're walking out with their wives after having a great dinner, like it just shows like that's the type of character he is.
Yeah. There was something else I wanted to say. You got anything else?
I guess the last thing I would think about is like, I wonder what Real Madrid play, because they didn't know who Florentino was. Like they didn't know this guy at that point. Like I think even Hierro or one of them says like it was just this. We just knew he did well in business. We didn't really know anything else about him.
Yeah.
And the first thing he does, his first act as president, is sign Luis Figo. And like Roberto Carlos said early in the documentary that he didn't believe it was going to happen.
Yeah.
And he does the impossible. I wonder just kind of what their perception was, like what their thoughts were at that time, and what their thoughts were about Florentino Perez after that. It's just kind of an interesting. It must have been just like almost. I'm sure the whole squad talked about it. Like it must have been crazy for them to experience.
Well, just the visionary part of this too, like because if you think about like the tone and what the words he's using. Lorenzo Sanz is saying it's impossible. And then there's the other guy, what's his name? The one we were talking about, Ramon.
De la Morena.
Yeah. He's telling Florentino it's impossible. And Florentino like basically uses that as fuel to like want to do it more. And then he goes on and does the impossible with Zidane, does the impossible with Ronaldo, does the impossible with Beckham. Then he leaves, things go wrong. He gets it wrong on the sporting level, comes back 2009, comes back with a bang. He wants to do the Super League, whether you want to agree with it or not. But you got to give him credit for like the fact that he just thinks differently. He's a visionary. He's not... He's pragmatic, but he's also comfortable with taking risks and putting himself out there. Because and he's a visionary.
Well, and the other thing with Florentino is that, and I think the documentary slightly touched on this, but the other thing is, since he was 10, 11 years old, he was going to Real Madrid games. Santiago Bernabeu as president, who created this team that won 5 European Cups. He saw Di Stefano, he saw Gento, he saw Puskás, he saw all these guys. That's what he grew up with, and so he believed in this mythical Real Madrid and in the aura and just the institution and what it should be and stand for. And so his whole goal as president has been to replicate that. And like everything he does is role modeled after Santiago Bernabeu. And so like he's brought this visionary concept, but he's also basically mirrored what one of the greatest predecessors did. And I think that's like Florentino's had this boyhood dream and vision of what Real Madrid should be, and he's brought it to reality. And like he is one of the ultimate Madridistas and ultimate fans of the club. And I think that's the beautiful thing in this is like Florentino truly, truly loves Real Madrid, and he just wants it to be what he's always known it and remembered it to be from his time as a boy going to the Santiago Bernabeu.
Yeah, and I was gonna say like, with regards to his vision and his belief in doing the impossible, that was a trait that Real Madrid president we didn't have as a president since Santiago Bernabeu, yes, to himself. You know, the vision to bring in Di Stefano, to take a gamble on a 31-year-old overweight Puskás who hadn't played football in 2 years when no one else had the balls to do that, and just gave him a briefcase of cash because he believed. And so there's that visionary aspect. I don't know if I have to do a deep dive on it, but I'm sure Florentino has some pretty, I would assume, some high praise for Bernabeu himself and what he thinks of him. Yeah.
He's openly said that he models like everything he does after Santiago Bernabeu.
All right. What else do we got before we wrap it up? Did we cover it all?
I think that's it. I mean, I'm assuming most everybody who's listening to this has watched the documentary, but if you haven't, definitely watch it. It's fantastic. It's different, and it's nice because it's not only is it kind of a Barca Real Madrid documentary, but it's covering a specific topic. It's not just about kind of the game and things of that nature. So I think it does a really nice job. And like you said, how you kind of have to come to your own conclusions based on everyone's story. Like I like that aspect of it as well.
You have watched many more documentaries than I have, so I want to ask you this, because I haven't seen any. Like, you know, there's the Cruz one, there's another one, right, about Real Madrid, just Real Madrid. What's it called?
Oh, well, the Amazon Prime one.
Yeah, the Amazon one. So there's a few that I haven't watched. This also makes me want to go back and watch the Pelé one, which these guys also made, which I haven't seen yet. So where does this? Is this the best documentary that we have in the last couple of years?
About the team, I think yes. Like the Amazon Prime one, I think it's good, but it doesn't move at like the pace that this one does. The Amazon Prime, and it's way more focused on like the historical aspect of Real Madrid, which it's got some cool footage. Like it's got color footage of Di Stefano and that time period and stuff, and interviews with Gallego and I think Piri and just all different Real Madrid players. So it's really interesting to hear their stories and stuff. But like if you're not deep into Real Madrid, you're not going to enjoy that. Like this is a documentary that any football fan or anybody period would find interesting.
Yeah.
The only documentary, like soccer documentary, it's not Real Madrid specific, that I would say maybe edges this is the Diego Maradona one. I don't remember what the full name of it was, but it was on HBO. It was released on HBO a couple of years ago. It's unbelievable. One of the best documentaries I've ever seen, period.
Yeah, I was thinking about it because I was like, this one and the other one that you mentioned, I think the Amazon Prime one, I wanted to do, podcasts about it, and I never really got around to it. But this one, it was...
Oh, there's the Galacticos one, too, on ESPN.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's the one that I wanted to watch, but then I couldn't because of geolocation things in Canada. You couldn't watch it for whatever reason. Now I know how VPN works, so I could have watched it or whatever. But maybe too much time has passed now. It kind of feels irrelevant to do a podcast about it now. But but this one definitely was worth it.
Yeah, this one tops the list for sure of those three.
Yeah. If you haven't watched it already, go and do that. And we didn't discuss anything else this week at international break stuff or whatever because I wanted this podcast to just be standalone. When people look it up, it'll be just ageless. You can listen to it whenever. Yeah. It's not time sensitive. Has nothing to do with what's happening right now this weekend. For that, I think Matt and I are going to do a podcast on Tuesday Tapas over on patreon.com/Managing Madrid. If you want access to that, go over there and get access, and we'll see you there. Matt, thanks. This was fun, man.
Yep, definitely can.
We'll talk soon. Take care.
Thanks. Yep, bye.
All right, before we wrap it up, we wanted to give a shout out to our patrons over on patreon.com/Managing Madrid. All of our patrons get a ton of exclusive content just for being a patron and being part of this ever-growing Real Madrid family. Also wanted to give a shout out to our $10 plus patrons specifically because if you pledge $10 or more, not only do you get guaranteed responses to your questions, but you also get a specific shout out on the podcast. So shout out to Brandon Alvarez, Willie Reed, Will Sousa, Way Paring, Wamik Jamal, Umar Mahadi, Tyler Dixon, Tobias Arroyo Botcher, Tarek Goktas, Talib Salhab, Tahmid Kalam, Sushank Damala, Sujai Wani, Sumanchu Singh, Sherry Sorio, Sheikh Hatiri, Shamil, Shabazz Sharapov, Sergio Arispe, Santos Solorzano, Samuli Justin, Samir Z, Said Mahad, Sai Mohan, Sasi Kumar, Rodrigo Balmaceda, Rishi D, Phoenix, Peter Powell, Paulo Fierro, Patrick Diafari, Oscar Barrera, Nico Laxo, Nicolas Zapatero Zubiare, Nicolas Moller, Nick Ribeiro, Nelson Mazariego, Mowgli, MJ Diego, Michael Zinberg, Marin Myrtle, Matthew Atkins, Martin Ridman, Magnus Lex, Logan Stahl, Leon Stavronakis, Kunal Tilakar, Crystal Glass, Kevin Rivera, Jose Cruz, John Fernandez, Jeff Thurston, Jason Fitz, Ian Marley, Graham Gerard, Gary Kohut, Frederick Rentakiro, Frederick Sundros, Faisal Hamdan, S.A. Davisito, Eloy Enriquez, Edward Sossman, Daniel Williams, Con P, Christian Toff, Christian Acosta, Charles Williams, Brendan Powers, Brandon Stevens, Ashik Bashar, Armand Gashi, Armando L, Antons Rudenko, Anirudh Singh, Ananya Kumar, Alex Thyberg, Al Azaz Hussein, Adrian Rios, Adar Zalukovic, Adam Dorsey, Bella Chow, Varun Ramtin Mahrur, Fabian Moreno, Daniel Smith. We love you guys so much. Thank you, and Hala Madrid.